Welcome to episode 145 of the XS Noize Podcast. I'm Mark Millar. Thanks for listening. In this episode, I speak to Steven Wilson about his 7th album, the Harmony Codex. If you missed the previous episode, I spoke to Andrew and Simon from the brand new Heavies about Never Stop, their new best of compilation. So check it out. And if you like the podcast, please subscribe on your favourite listening platform, give us a rating, and leave a comment. Steven Wilson is an artist and producer based in North London. His last album, The Future Bites, charted at number 4 in the UK and was nominated for 2 Grammys. He is also the founding member of Porcupine Tree, whose last album, Closure Continuation, charted at number 2. Steven returns with his latest album, the Harmony Codex. It isn't like any other records you'll hear this year. It's endlessly fascinating, endlessly revealing, and endlessly beautiful. In this interview, we discuss the Harmony Codex, Spatial Audio, his recent book, Limited Edition of 1, the Album Years podcast, and lots more. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the XS Noize Podcast with Steven Wilson. So hi Steven, welcome to the XS Noize Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
We're here to talk about your new album, The Harmony Codex. It's absolutely tremendous. We've lots to unpack. But before we go into that, in your book, Limited Edition of 1, which was released last year, or published last year, the final chapter is a short story called The Harmony Codex about brother and sister Jamie and Harmony. Mm-hmm. Now, you say in the book that the story relates to the upcoming album. So what came first, the story or the music?
Well, the simple answer is both and neither, because they were both, they both started off as sort of, oh my goodness me, I'm in lockdown, I can't go on tour, I can't leave the house, what am I going to do to fill all my time type things. So the book started shortly after lockdown kicked in as a project I could kind of fill this time with. And so did the album in a way, because I didn't really anticipate going straight back into writing for another record. I'd literally just finished The Future Bites. It was just about to come out. I had a tour lined up. And of course, that all got thrown to the wind by COVID and by lockdown. So I couldn't really do anything else except retreat to my studio. And so the answer to your question is I was kind of working on the book, but I was also developing material. And they were kind of pushing each other along a bit, you know, so a little bit of that, a little bit of the book, and then, I could use that for a song. And then I'd write a song, and then I'd develop the book a bit more. So there was a kind of symbiotic thing going on where they were both pushing each other along a little bit.
Yeah, so you were just writing bits and then you were just getting ideas and go, well, we going from the page or the laptop and then going to the studio and putting a bit down or writing lyrics down, or how did it work?
Yeah, so my days, I like to fill my days with all sorts of different things all the time. So I'll go to the studio for a couple of hours. I'll come out and I'll write for a while, take the dogs for a walk, come back, I don't know, catch up on some emails, go back to the studio. So there's always this stuff going on. And they do naturally, even without me intending to, they start to influence each other. Even the dog walks, being out in nature makes you think about different things. Thoughts occur to you. And you come back and you jot them down. So a bit of lyrics, bit of music, bit of writing. Yeah, so it was all kind of going on at the same time. And also actually ironically enough, this is for your podcast, I started a podcast at the beginning of lockdown as well. So it was like suddenly all this time, as I say, that kind of I hadn't anticipated having opened up for me. And I started all these projects off thinking that I wasn't going to have, anything to do if I didn't. So the podcast, the book, the writing of the new album, probably some other things too, which I've forgotten, all kind of came about in those first few weeks of lockdown.
Yeah, we'll get to the podcast actually, because it's one of my favorite podcasts. Did you enjoy writing the book? The first time you'd actually written anything like that?
I did. I mean, I was working with a guy called Mick Wall, who's a very experienced music biographer. He wasn't ghostwriting. In fact, quite the opposite. I was kind of doing the writing, but we would start off from the point of view where we would have a conversation a bit like we are now. We would pick a subject like, I don't know, the relationship with your listeners and your fans. And or how did you discover music as a kid? So we'd pick a very basic sort of area of topic to discuss. And then we would have a 2 or 3 hour conversation. Mick would get it transcribed, send it to me, and then I would sort of fashion it into a chapter in the book. I have to say, I did enjoy it, but it was hard. I mean, it's a lot harder than I thought it was going to be to write. I mean, one of the things that obviously is obvious when you think about it is that there are a million ways to construct a sentence from the same, you've got a bunch of words, you can construct your sentence and then you can look at it and go, there's a better way to say that. And, maybe I should move that word there and move that comma there. And I'm obsessive about that stuff, as I am with music, sound design and production and mixing. I get totally sucked into those kind of details. And with writing, it was the same. There were so many different ways to construct a sentence, to construct a paragraph, to construct a chapter, that I got really lost in that. And I found it quite hard to actually definitively say something was finished, which is not something it's not a problem I have with music, funnily enough. People ask me that quite a lot. When do you know when something's finished? I just do. But I struggled actually with the writing to know when something was finished. I guess I just don't have the same experience.
What I liked about the book, it wasn't a conventional biography. There was a bit about your life and a bit about, all your projects, but then it was broke up by your lists, your the most depressing songs you've written, and things like that. And then at the end, there was a short story. So it was very good.
Yeah. So the short story, which obviously then became the album as well. The short story was there because I think, well, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, obviously I harbored pretensions of being a fiction writer and I wanted to have a go. But secondly, I thought actually writing a short story, writing a piece of fiction in many ways would be just as revealing about, what makes me create, what makes my creative clock tick, as it were, as anything I could write about, my history or my personality or, or my work. So if you read that story, there's so many of the sort of things that you'd be familiar with if you've listened to my music and you read my lyrics, a lot of the same, kind of concerns, the same use of language. So I discussed this with Mick and we both felt, I think, that a piece of fiction would be as good as any way of revealing my creative process. And again, I found that quite hard to come down on a definitive sort of text, but I'm very proud of that. And the reason, one of the reasons I based the album on it was because I was proud of the story. Yeah.
Well, your last album, The Future Bites, it was my favorite album of 2021. It's an incredible record. It's a masterpiece, but I think you've surpassed it with the Harmony Codex. You said in the press release, I want listeners to take a journey where they don't know what's going to come next. And you certainly did that. Not only did I not know what kind of songs were coming next on the album, but within the songs, there was I was constantly surprised with the musical twists and turns.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I've been describing the album as a piece of cinema for the ears. And I think there's something that is very cinematic about it. I mean, people have used that word with my music before, but something particularly with this record feels analogous with cinema. And I think it's that when you watch a movie or you watch something visual, a TV show, whatever it is, you have this sense of there being scenes, and within the scene, something will happen that drives the narrative forward. And that thing can be something tragic. It can be something joyous. It can be something to do with loss or nostalgia or regret. It can be something violent. It can be something sexual, whatever it is that drives the narrative forward. So in a movie or a TV show, you have this sequence of scenes where you don't know what to expect. You don't know how the story is going to unfold. And that's what drives the drama. And that's what kind of gets you hooked and engaged. You want to know what's coming next. And that doesn't normally happen in music. Music, normally with an album, you kind of have 10 versions of the same thing. And I'm not saying this as a criticism because I love a lot of records like this, but most records, you kind of have 10 aspects of the same thing. So an artist has a particular style. It could be happy, it could be sad, it could be aggressive, it could be mellow, it could be chill out. And that tends to set the tenor for the whole record. And what I like is making records which are more analogous with that idea of movies or TV shows, where these scenes constantly take the narrative in an unexpected direction. So one scene, quote unquote, is joyous. The next scene is tragic. The next scene is nostalgic for the past. And you can take that also to the point where that's changing the whole musical vocabulary that you use from track to track. So one track is electronic, one track is more rock, one track is more ambient, one track is more acoustic. And that's definitely the approach I took with the Harmony Codex. So to me, that's what makes it so, quote unquote, cinematic.
It doesn't sound like anything you've done before. Nobody can ever accuse Steven Wilson of being predictable. As a fan of your music, it's exciting to hear what you'll do next, because nobody can second guess what you'll come up with, But because of that, it divides your fan base quite a lot, doesn't it?
It does. And I think part of the contract with doing that is that you're confronting the audience's expectations, the listeners' expectations, is you do expect some of them to be disappointed with what you do. And I think Future Bites, is fair to say, probably disappointed more of my listeners than any of my other records had, because for a lot of my listeners, anything that's notionally pop or commercial or song orientated is not really what they want from me. I think what people mostly want from me, and I'm generalizing very broadly about my listeners here, but I think what a lot of them have, majority of them have, is this need to hear more long form, more complex, more progressive, for want of a better word, material. And Future Bites wasn't about that. It was very much my version of a more streamlined electronic pop record, and still quite experimental by the standards of most, streamlined pop records, but still, nevertheless, in comparison with the rest of my catalogue, quite a direct and electronic pop record. And of course, I knew that was going to be very divisive, and so it was. So for every person like yourself that really rates it very highly, there's someone who, just completely missed them. And I kind of knew that was going to happen, but I also knew that I had to make the record. I needed to make the record. And I also knew that the next record was going to be completely different again. And I think that's something that you have to get used to, is that listeners will always, in a way, take each record as an indication of, oh, okay, well, this is what he's going to do now. Well, so no, not really. No, that's just one record. I'm going to do something completely different again. And again, maybe that's because they get used to that from other artists. That if another artist makes a stylistic shift, people, they tend to kind of stick with that for a number of albums. And that's not really my philosophy. I like to almost take each album as every album to be a reaction, in a way, against the previous album.
Yeah, but also because of that, from going back right to the start, from everything you've done, there's something in there for everybody. I
like to think so. Yeah. I mean, somebody the other day said to me, this is almost like a greatest hits album for you, isn't it? Because it kind of represents every aspect of your personality. And I think that's true. And obviously, as you said, and I agree with you, I think there's something very new about this record too. But there is also a sense that there are some songs on this album that couldn't have existed without Future Bites coming first. Some of the more electronic songs on the record, even if they are a bit more conceptual and experimental this time, there's a sense that there is continuity there. There are some songs that could have been written for Blackfield. There are some songs that could have been on 90s Porcupine Tree albums. So there's almost an element that I've allowed all of the different aspects of my career over the years to manifest in some way. And I think, as you say, in that sense, there's something, at least there's a doorway that anyone can walk through. And hopefully, if the other material isn't immediately appealing to them, they'll spend time with the record as a whole, because there's something on it that they can grab hold of.
Well, my entry point for your music was To the Bone.
Right. Yeah, I remember. Yeah, and again, that wasn't as divisive as the Future Bites, but it was still a divisive record, because it was moving away from what I would call the more old-fashioned progressive rock tropes into something a little bit more 80s influenced. And so some people didn't like that so much. I mean, I'm proud of all the records. What I love about all the records is that they are all different, and they all have a purpose in the sort of catalogue. They all have a sort of a reason to exist in the catalogue. So yes, that's my this record, and that's my that record, and this is another kind of record, and they're all different, and they're all part of a continuum, and they're all part of a trajectory. And I hope people will become as fascinated by the whole thing as they are by these individual entries in it.
Well, the Harmony Codex has been previewed with spatial audio listening sessions with acoustics for fans in cities including London, New York, Berlin, LA, and Amsterdam. And there'll be more leading up to the release. How much have you enjoyed seeing fans react to the album in that environment?
It's been amazing. And it's been one of the real joys about the whole rollout of this album is been doing those events. And, you know, understanding that a lot of people, even if they buy the Blu-ray disc, which has got the Atmos mix on it, they're never going to get to hear it really like that, in a room like that, with the music coming from above them, behind them, beside them. So being able to get as many people as possible out to hear the record in what is the ultimate kind of listening experience has been amazing. And just, we've been playing the record in the dark, so it's like turning the lights off. And you know, one thing I've said in my intros when I've been able to go along to these playbacks, and I've been able to intro the playback, is I've said, this is how I first, when I was a teenager, this is how I first engaged with music. I would turn off the lights and I would listen to records from beginning to end in the dark. This is before we had phones, before we had the internet. You know, you just turned off the lights and you allowed the record to take you on a journey. And it's almost that kind of sensory deprivation thing where you've only got your ears. You've only got your ears, and you just go inside the music. And that's what people were able to do at these playbacks. And a lot of people sort of said that to me. They said, I haven't listened to a record like that since I was 15, you know. And because we don't get time. I mean, you know, I'm the same. I don't get time anymore. I'm always multitasking. We all are. It's the 21st century, isn't it? We've all got too much stuff going on. We're always multitasking. So we're listening to music while we're replying to emails or whatever it is we're doing. And it's nice sometimes to almost be forced to go back to those kind of, you know, really early listening experiences where you just allowed yourself to disappear into the record.
You also previewed your XTC and Keen Crimson mixes in L Acoustics demo rooms. What attracted you to working with L Acoustics? The room they have just sounds, it's the best spatial audio playback room I've come across, you know. I mean, the Dolby's one in Soho is fantastic too. I love that one, but that's more like a cinema environment. This feels more intimate. It's a smaller room. I always say with spatial audio, in a way, the smaller the room, the better, because if the room is very big, the sound starts to become a little bit too diffuse and you can't tell, is that coming from above me? Is it coming from beside? I can't really tell. It's just kind of, it's out there somewhere. And the beautiful thing about L Acoustics is it's the perfect kind of size, I think. You can get about 40 people in there. Everyone is in the sweet spot and everyone gets the same, you know, perfect spatial audio listening experience, I think. And also the guys, Julie and her team down there, are just delightful, absolutely delightful to deal with, and have been so supportive of me. And I think we're doing an event with Chic, with my Chic Atmos mixes in a couple of weeks too. Yeah, so there's more to come. Wow. From a songwriting point of view, how difficult was it to write the music and songs with spatial audio in mind?
So I didn't really write them with spatial audio in mind, but I certainly recorded them with spatial audio in mind. I think it would have been difficult to have written the songs with spatial audio in mind, because it might have sort of led me down a path of making things less musical and more technical. So the writing was still the writing. I still trying to come up with great melodies, great piano parts, great guitar parts, good lyrics, good vocal lines, good harmonies, all of that stuff. Still trying to come up with what is essentially a good song, quote unquote, you know, quality song. But certainly when I started recording, I was aware that this was going to be the first album I'd really made with spatial audio kind of at the forefront of my mind, in the sense of, I know I'm going to be doing a spatial audio mix of this. And also wanting really to try and raise the bar in terms of what's possible with spatial audio, because having done 3.5 years or 4 years now of spatial audio mixing myself, Atmos, and even going, you know, further back in the past doing 5.1 before that, I've got quite a lot of experience now in terms of what I've done in Atmos and spatial audio. And I felt like my album should be the one where I kind of take all of that knowledge, all of that experience, and try and bring it to bear and raise the bar on what's possible in spatial audio. And I don't mean making something really gimmicky, because that stuff is as annoying as as not doing a good mix. If you do a mix that's too busy, it's just as bad as doing a very conservative mix, which doesn't make use of the space at all. So it's finding that sort of perfect point where the mix feels really immersive, but without being distractingly so. So when I was recording, I was definitely aware of certain things like multi-tracking vocals, multi-tracking keyboard parts, how I would split the drum recording, all of those things, knowing in the back of my mind, that will work really well in spatial audio. And to be honest, that wasn't difficult. That was a very intuitive, very natural process to go through. I think I've just been so used to mixing in spatial audio now and knowing instinctively what works best and what doesn't.
Do you think it's possible to make sound even more immersive? I mean, where can you see the technology going in the future?
I think the main innovation is going to be in a live context. So at the moment, we can listen to spatial audio in a playback event like that. We can listen to it binaurally on headphones at home, or if we're lucky enough to have a proper spatial system in our front room, we can listen at home. To me, the next logical development is how can we bring that to the context of a concert experience, live music. And that's just beginning. So obviously L Acoustics have their system installed at this venue in Earth in London, in Hackney, which I'm going to be playing a launch event at in the week of release. And there are other places like the Roundhouse in London now where they have spatial audio set up. And I think more and more venues are going to start installing spatial audio. So then it's how does the artist make use of these things? And that's where not a lot is happening yet. Because it's definitely a learning curve, and it's definitely going to be a question of seeing what can work in a live context. So again, I find myself for the first time in my life really at the forefront of something that is potentially changing, and I'm excited about the possibilities of perhaps doing something, equivalent of the playback events, the spatial audio playback events, but taking that into the live performance arena.
Let's get more into the album. But before we get into the songs, I would like to know what's the idea behind the album sleeve with the staircase of the colourful bricks?
So the obviously the black and white skyscraper in the back is supposed to be the building from the short story, the Harmony Codex.
Yes.
Yeah.
That now.
The shape, the icon, the logo is a kind of very simple, iconic representation of a staircase. So obviously, if you read the story, you know that the central kind of motif in the story is this idea of the never-ending staircase. So here we have a kind of visual representation of the staircase, and there are 10 blocks in the staircase, and there are 10 different colors, and there are 10 songs on the album, which are 10 almost completely different styles. So to me, there's this beautiful kind of connection between the staircase having 10 different colored blocks and there being 10 quite distinctly different approaches to music making on the record.
Well, visual aesthetics play a significant role in your music with stunning album artwork, live visuals. So how do you approach the visual aspect of your projects, and how does you think it enhances the overall experience to your audience?
Well, I grew up at the sort of tail end of the great era for vinyl. I was buying records, I started buying records at the end of the 70s, carried on buying records through most of the 80s. And then by the end of the 80s, I was buying CDs like a lot of people. But I still remember that very kind of tactile experience of buying a record, taking it home, opening it, looking at the gatefold sleeve or the lyric sheets, putting the record on. And I have a real attachment to that, kind of romantic attachment to that physical, tactile experience of listening to music. And I love that idea that a piece of music could also be a piece of art, something that you would really want to treasure, something you'd want to collect, something you'd want to look after. and that you could also give more clues to the music through the artwork. And of course, that was something that the progressive rock bands were really good at, taking this conceptual rock music and expanding it through the artwork into conceptual artwork. And I grew up, one of the first albums I ever remember, I'm sure we've talked about this before, one of the first albums I ever remember being aware of was my dad's copy of Dark Side of the Moon, and how the artwork kind of had that sense of intellectual cool. It wasn't even a picture of the band on it, it was just somehow an extension of the music, a further kind of enigmatic representation of the sound and the audio. And I've always felt that way, and I think a lot of my audience feel that way too. So I always put a lot of effort into the physical side, trying to make this something that people will actually want to own rather than just stream off of a file server somewhere. So a lot of that is coming up with this beautiful artwork. And the simple answer to your question, your first part of your question really is, I've been very lucky to have come across and worked with a bunch of extraordinary artists and illustrators and filmmakers in my career. People like Hayo Muller, who did the artwork to this record. Also Carl Glover, the designer. I have a long relationship with him. Previously, people like Lasse Hoyle, Jess Cope, the animator, who's made a lot of the videos for me. And now a new video guy I'm working with, Charlie De Placido, who's made the dance video for Economies of Scale. I've been very lucky. I think something about my music appeals to these kind of people. They feel like they can do something interesting. They feel like they can be a bit more experimental and be a bit more arty about the way they approach, whether it's the video, the artwork, or the design. So I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of people that are really at the top of their game, and we really enjoy the process of collaborations. I certainly do.
The special edition bespoke box set of the Future Bass was a genius idea.
Yeah, that was such a great concept. It's, in a way, that's why I'm so sad I never got to tour it, because that whole concept of selling product, almost having a record as kind of equivalent to marketing a new brand of sneaker or soap powder or something, I thought that was such a great concept. I really had so many ideas for that as a live presentation. It's such a shame. Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it anyway. Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the songs. The album begins with Inclination. What a track to start with. I love how it begins with the drumming and the heavy breathing. And then at the 309 mark, you come in with a part falsetto. The drumming and guitar textures are fantastic, the whole way through the track.
Yeah, that was one of two tracks on the album. Actually, no, three tracks on the album that were almost made in almost like a collage kind of a way, in the sense that I got a lot of different musicians to basically play, improvise, experiment, respond however they wanted to some basic ideas that I sent them. And so there's almost a cast of thousands on that. I think there's about 10 or 11 different musicians on that track. And so there's trumpet, there's different guitar players, different keyboard parts, different drum parts, percussion parts. And I think my job, in a way, was almost to go through and edit this piece of music together, almost by, taking all of these different ingredients I had and finding the right combination and the right flow and the right storytelling, the way that the song would tell the right story. And they were hard. They were the hardest ones to put together on the record, because there's so many different ways I could have put that track together. But yes, I think it was an obvious opener because it's such a strange new sound for a Steven Wilson record. Certainly to open a Steven Wilson record, that kind of first thing you hear is this trumpet, and then you hear this kind of weird scattershot, almost machine gun like fractured electronic beat, and it's like, wow, what's this? And then, as you say, there's almost that, it almost falls to complete silence around the 3-minute mark, and you think the track's over. And then my voice comes out of silence and the track begins to build again. And I just thought that was quite a powerful and intriguing way to open the record.
Yeah, absolutely. Economies of Scale was the first track we heard from the album. I'm sure it was hard to choose a song that represents the album because the whole album is so diverse. Why did you choose to put that out first?
I think we had a fantastic video, which helped. So, I commissioned about 4 or 5 videos a long time ago, and that was I think that was the one that came back first. And I think my whole team were just blown away from it, because one thing you've never seen in a Steven Wilson video is dance. Actually, no, there was the Bollywood dances, wasn't there? But this was a completely different kind of dance. This was kind of like movement, and it's all done in one take as well. So it's like, wow, it's like one of those wow videos. So I think firstly, the video was so strong. Secondly, in some ways, I felt like it was a continuation of Future Bites, but in the sense that it's a very electronic language, in the sense that the rhythm tracks are very electronic. But there's something about it that's also more experimental. So it's the use of harmony voices, for example, in the middle. It's quite unexpected. The way the track unfolds is quite unexpected. It felt like something that would at least intrigue people as an opening sort of salvo from the record. It wasn't something immediately familiar, but at the same time, it felt like it might be a natural continuation from the last couple of records.
The video was great as well, and in the room that the video was in, and then you're sitting in the sort of corner, aren't you, or in the chair? How long did you have to sit there for?
Well, I think we must have shot that sequence, because it's all one shot. We must have shot it something like 25 to 30 times. So I mean, feel for the dancers, because they were. I think the take that we eventually used was something like take 21 or 22. So they were exhausted, but they were still you can tell they were still giving it their all on every single take. So my all I had to do was sit there and read a newspaper, but I was sitting there all day. Yeah. It took us a day, from early in the day till late at night, to get a definitive take. I mean, to get something like that is so difficult, obviously, because if one little thing goes wrong, you're back to square one again. So, but wow, super proud of that video.
And then you followed it up with the 10-minute long Impossible Tightrope track, which is accompanied by an amazing animated video, which is completely immersive.
Yeah, so that's the complete opposite. That's completely made in the computer by a brilliant young director called Miles Scarin, and he's done some stuff for me before, but I think he's excelled himself with this. When he first said to me, "I'm going to create an 11-minute CGI video for your 11-minute your video," I'm like, "Wow, it's going to take you months and months, isn't it?" Because it's a lot of work, But I think he didn't sleep for about 4 months making that video. It is absolutely amazing, yeah. And of course, there's very little vocal in that video, so. In that song, so the video has to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of keeping people's emotional engagement in what they're watching and what they're listening to. So yeah, I mean the first two videos off the album, I think, have made a very, very strong impression. Also because musically the two pieces are very different, and that's why in a way I wanted the two videos to come so close together. In fact, we're releasing another one on Tuesday, so there'll be 3 videos in 3 weeks. And we're releasing the video for Rock Bottom, which is the duet with Ninet. So I wanted to get as much music out there as quickly as possible, because I didn't want people to do that thing that people do. And I'm not blaming them, because I do this too. That thing that people do where they hear one song off the record and they go, oh, that's what the album's like then. And they make an assumption based on hearing one song that the whole album is like that. And as we already discussed, you can't do that with this record. You just cannot do that with this record, because every song is different. So it was important to me to get 2 or 3 songs out very quickly to give people more of a feel for how diverse this record is, and for the videos to be similarly strong.
Well, I'm glad Rock Bottom's coming out next, because that I was actually about to say it's my favorite track on the album. Right. The duet with Ninet. She returns for the album. What a voice she has. What do you enjoy about working with her?
Well, you said it. I mean, what a voice she has. But she's a force of nature. I think she's one of the greatest female singers right out there right now. And if not the greatest, if I'm a bit biased, but I think she's incredible. And because she's so uncompromising as an artist, she's not as well known as she should be. And, I think some of the duets I've done with her have been real highlights in my catalogue and in my catalogue. There's something magical about the way we work together. If I'm writing for her, or if we're duetting or producing, In fact, we've talked about this. We really think the next thing we both do, should be a whole album together, because there seems to be something very special about when we work together. So that could well be the next project. You heard it here first, folks. So yeah, it's been a joy. In this case, it's her song. And it's her song that I heard on a demo she sent me a couple of years ago, where she'd done it in a kind of indie guitar style. And I immediately heard the song and I thought, no, this should be like a big John Barry Bond theme type of sound. This should be epic, pompous, dramatic, a big orchestrated Bond theme ballad. And I said to her, do you mind if I arrange it that way? And she said, no, great. And she's really easy to work with. And she loved what I did, even though it's completely different to what she'd intended. And yeah, it's a really magical track. Absolutely.
And Pariah from Through the Bone, it's absolutely exceptional track.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I say, there's something magical every time we work together. I don't know what it is, but it just seems to click.
Well, I'll look forward to your collaboration album with her.
Yeah, I think that could well be on the cards.
Another surprise on the album, constantly getting surprised with tracks on the album, your distorted voice on actual brutal facts.
Well, yeah, I've got a history of messing with my voice, because the simple fact is I never thought of myself as a singer. I never necessarily wanted to be a singer. I ended up being a singer in Porcupine Tree by default. And I've definitely got better over the years and more confident as a singer. But at the same time, I think one of the things I've done over the years is find ways to make up for the fact that I don't think I've got the strongest voice, by manipulating it and processing it in various ways. And actually the whole harmony thing, the fact that I have a lot of big harmonies on certain songs, big blocks of harmony, that was also kind of a side product of that, not having the strongest voice. So how can I get around that? Well, I can track it loads of times and build up these big harmonies. So that was part of that too. And another manifestation of that, which is the one you refer to, is on actual brutal facts, playing with the pitch of my voice. So in this case, it's slowed down to sound much deeper, and it takes on quite a sinister kind of hue, which fits the track, which is probably one of the more angry tracks on the record, more bitter and twisted tracks on the record. So, and the track itself is almost like proto hip hop. It's got these kind of hip hop beats going on, but it's extremely dark and extremely oppressive. And the voice, I think, the lyrics and the voice add to that effect. So yeah, it's been part of my thing, my MO over the years, is to find ways to twist my voice. And of course, in the modern world, using computer recording technology, there are so many interesting ways to change sound, to manipulate sound, to process sound, to twist sound into new shapes. And I love doing it. I completely embrace that. I think that's one of the great things about computer recording technology.
What song on the album was the most challenging to get right?
I think the last track on the record, Staircase, was the hardest one to get right, because I knew it was going to be the closer. And because I knew it was going to be the closing track, I wanted it to feel like the final scene in a movie. And a lot of film directors say the hardest scene is to pull off is the final scene, because you don't want to leave people disappointed. You've had all this build up and you want the payoff, to be the climax of the movie, to be satisfying. And to me, Staircase was going to be that. It was going to be the climax to this movie. And it's quite a complex track anyway. There's a lot of stuff going on. It follows a fairly unconventional structure. And I played around a lot with the structure, and I played around a lot with different musicians. I ended up with 2 different drummers playing simultaneously, because I tried 2 different approaches to the drumming. Neither of them were completely how I wanted. And then one day I just put them together and it was like, that's what I wanted. So I had Sam from Interpol was one drummer, and I had Craig from my band was the other drummer. And Craig was doing like this weird kind of drum and bass thing, very technical and very busy. And Sam was doing more of a kind of direct indie thing, alternative thing. And both of them were kind of half of what I wanted. So I put them together and I ended up with this kind of composite Frankenstein drum part. which was exactly what I wanted. But that process, which I've just described to you in about 30 seconds, took me weeks of tearing my hair out and trying different things. And so that was the hardest. That was the hardest to get right. Yeah.
And it's a great closer, great way to finish the album.
I think so. Yeah. I think it does have that kind of closing scene cinematic vibe to it. Yeah.
Some album formats have a reimagining of the album called harmonic distortion, which includes remixes from the likes of Manic Street Preachers, Interpol, Roland from Tears for Fears. How did you go about choosing who would reimagine the songs?
So a lot of these people are people I've worked with over the past few years, so I knew them. So I've done a remix for Manics, which hasn't come out yet, but I was already connected with Manics, and obviously I've been working with Tears for Fears catalogue. Sam had played on the record as the drummer on Staircase, so I was connected with him. So these were mostly people that I was already kind of connected to. And I think the answer to your question is I wanted to get people to reimagine the songs. I didn't want the sort of cliched, DJ culture dance floor remixes. I wanted people to almost come at it from a much more experimental perspective. And to that end, I thought it would be more interesting to ask people to do reimaginings that maybe had not done it before or very rarely had been asked to do a remix before. So someone like Roland, I'm not sure if Roland's ever done a remix before. I might be the first person he's ever remixed. I'm not sure about that, but I'm not aware of him having remixed anyone before. I think the Manics have done a couple, but not many. I think Interpol likewise have done a couple, but not that many. So it's almost like going out to people that you really admire, but that probably don't get invited that often to do that kind of thing. Because you think, well, they're going to have a more interesting sort of take and perspective on, if I say to them, can you reimagine this track? They're not just going to stick a 4 to the floor bass drum on it and turn it into a club mix. They're going to do something more interesting. And that's exactly the way it panned out. I got some really unusual things back, things I weren't expecting. I mean, the Manics mix is crazy. It's completely reimagines the song. I think the only thing recognizable from it is the vocal melody and the vocals. So they've completely reconstructed it. So that was kind of my decision making process there, to find the more unusual choices. Yeah.
Were you nervous in case you didn't like what you would hear back?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But you know what? That's true of everything. Every time I sent out the tracks to drummers, to bass players, to guitar players, to keyboard players, to trumpet players, whoever it was, I was sending the tracks out and saying, can you try some ideas on this? There was always the possibility that when I got it back, I wasn't going to like it. And that did happen. There are some remixes that didn't make it. There are some contributions that people made to the record that didn't make the final cut. And it's not because they were bad. It's just that they weren't what I specifically was looking for. They didn't fit into my vision. So one thing being a solo artist is, you're using a lot of musicians, you're going out to a lot of musicians, you're experimenting. I mean, that's kind of in the nature of being experimental, is putting yourself in a situation where you can't sort of produce. And this was during lockdown, so I really couldn't produce. I couldn't go to the studio and stand there while they were doing these things. So I had to allow myself to let some of my control go and allow myself to be surprised by the results, pleasantly or otherwise sometimes. So yeah, there was an element of that, of not knowing whether I would like things and sometimes not liking.
You're at the forefront of spatial audio, as we discussed, and you're the go-to guy for spatial audio mixes for other bands, including The Who, Suede, Tears for Fears, XTC, and lots more. What album have you enjoyed working on the most?
Oh, wow. I mean, I love them all for different reasons. That's the diplomatic answer, but it's also true. So I've just been doing the Chic catalogue with Niall, which has been a pleasure. What fantastic records they are. Suede again was for a completely different reason. I think in some ways, the ones I am most proud of are the albums that are the most underrated, or the artists that are the most underrated. So XTC is a band I've always loved since I was a kid, and I think they're so underrated. I think Andy Partridge and Colin Moulding, two of the finest songwriters the UK has ever produced. And for whatever reason, for a multitude of reasons, some of them their own fault because they stopped touring after 1982 and all that stuff, all the stuff that people know about XTC, they never really rose to the same level of success as some of their contemporaries, like, Depeche Mode and Tears for Fears. And I think in some ways they should have done because they were just as talented. So I'm very proud of the kind of reimagining, if you like, of their catalogue, and the fact that one thing I've seen a lot about the releases is people saying, "Oh, I didn't know XTC, but I bought it because Stephen Wilson's a fan and I like his mixes and I listen to it and I'm now a big fan." That to me was the greatest gift of all, introducing a band like XTC to my listeners who perhaps had never really listened to XTC before, had been, kind of somehow overlooked them. So that, in terms of satisfaction, that's one of the biggest joys I have about doing these remixes, is kind of introducing music that perhaps some of my listeners don't know to them. Yeah.
Is there a particular album you would love to get your hands on to mix?
So many. It's an almost never-ending list, What the one artist that I sort of name check time and time again, because I think her albums are so perfect for spatial audio, is Kate Bush.
Genius.
Say again, sorry?
She's a genius.
She is a genius. She is a genius, and her albums are perfect for surround because there's so much going on. There's so many elements of sound design and layering and production, and I would love to do that. Unfortunately, she's not that interested, and even if she was, she has a fantastic engineer, her own engineer, who also does Atmos mixes, so I probably would never get the chance, but one can dream. Yeah, so I think she's probably still top of my list in terms of things I would love to be able to do. Yeah.
What album would you choose first?
Well, funnily enough, the obvious one would be Hounds of Love. It's just a brilliant record. But funnily enough, my favourite Kate Bush record is The Dreaming, which is the album she made just before the Hounds of Love, which is a very experimental album where she's using her voice in ways that I've never heard anyone use their voice before, at least certainly not in the context of pop music. It's an extraordinary record. It was her Fairlight record. She was exploring the possibilities of using, so a very early record of using sampling, and it doesn't have any big hits on it. It's not that well known in her catalogue. It's certainly relative to the others, but I would love to have a crack at that one. Yeah.
As everyone knows, your work blends elements of rock, progressive music, electronic music. Have you ever had any cheesy pop melodies come into your head and you've thought, there's no way I could develop that any further, my fans would kill me?
Well, but I kind of, yes, it's the simple answer to your question. I do. I do have, I have a hard drive. I wouldn't say full of things like that, but there are a few things littered across it, which are probably things that you would describe the way you just described. Yeah. I mean, the one time I did really go with a very sort of pop, commercial, catchy song was Permeating on To the Bone. And of course, some of my fans absolutely hated that with a vengeance, and some of them really loved it. I think it was definitely a divisive song, to say the least. I still love it. Why I chose to go ahead with that one and not the others, I couldn't honestly say. I just really thought that was a successful piece of pop. I don't think it's the thing I do best, obviously, but I do love great pop, and so quite often I will find myself, humming catchy melodies, but I don't think it's probably not what it's probably not what I've been put on this earth to do. Let's just say that.
Terminating, it became a real earworm.
I think it's really catchy. Yeah, it's really. Yeah. It's funny because, of course, it's become one of my most streamed and one of my most popular songs online. The funny thing is, and this is something I think you get used to, is that it's very easy to fall into the trap of believing that your immediate hardcore fan base are somehow representative of the whole world of music lovers. And of course, they're not. They're the most possessive of your legacy, and they're the ones that will tell you in the loudest voices what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong. But actually, over time, what proves to be the case is very often the songs that they think are too commercial and too simple are actually the ones that have the farthest reach and reach the most people and get the most streams. Pariah is my most streamed song of all. It's by far my most popular song, and which is the duet with Ninet, of course. And that wasn't a particularly popular song with my fan base. They thought it was too strong, too slick, too short, too catchy. So it's funny that very often the fan base will be the most, the first to kick against anything that has, I suppose, more of a potentially mainstream appeal. But I've learned that over the years, and I've learned to sort of take a step back from that and understand that you can't always rely on your biggest fans and your closest fans to be, the sole kind of gatekeepers of what you choose to release and what you don't.
I think if Pariah had been released, say, in the 80s or 90s, when people actually bought records and there was charts, it would have been huge.
I think you're right. I think the same of Permeating. I think you're right. I think the same of Economies of Scale. I think the same of Personal Shopper. I think the same of lots of my songs. It's unfortunate that I am operating in an era where the whole sort of pop end of the market now has become so focus grouped to the point that you cannot even get a song on the radio anymore that has an intro. You can't. Yeah. If something has a guitar solo, forget it. We're not going to play that. It's got a guitar solo. So it's become all about the vocal and the stranglehold that the sort of R&B, sort of X Factor style of singing has on modern pop. If you don't have that kind of voice, the kind of Ed Sheeran, X Factor kind of voice, you can't get on mainstream radio anymore. So unless you're a legacy, if you're a legacy artist, you probably still can, so people like Elton John can still get on the radio. But it's a sad thing to me that perhaps some of my more accessible songs could have infiltrated the mainstream a lot more than they have because of the era that I'm operating in. But you know what? I have to be happy with what I have achieved. Essentially doing pretty much what I want. So in that sense, I can't complain.
If you were to recommend one of your albums, apart from the Harmony Codex, if you were to recommend one of your albums to someone who had never heard your music before, what album would you tell them to start with?
So that's difficult to answer, because what I always say to that kind of question is it depends on the agenda of the person asking. So I would need to know more about that person. I know this is a real cop-out. It's a real cop-out. But if so for example, if I said to that person, what's your favorite band? And they said Iron Maiden, I'm not going to recommend them The Future Bites. Mm-hmm. If I said to that person, what's your favorite band? And they said Depeche Mode, I'd say go and listen to The Future Bites. So it's very hard to generalize about that. Obviously, there are albums that I'm more proud of than others. The Harmony Codex, I'm obviously very proud of. And I think, like we said earlier, there's kind of a little bit of everything. So in some ways, it is a good one as a first point of call. But beyond that, I would need to know more about the specific agenda of who was asking me. If somebody said they loved old-fashioned prog rock, I'd say go and listen to The Raven That Refused to Sing, no doubt. So, and that's partly because I've made all these different kinds of albums and all these different kinds of styles. So I'd need to know which album would fit which person in that sense.
Your podcast, The Album Years with Tom, it's one of my favorite podcasts. You haven't done any in a while. Do you plan, obviously because you've been busy, do you plan on doing more?
We've actually recorded 10 more episodes and they haven't come out yet, but we have recorded 10 more. And they'll be out before the end of the year. Yeah. So we have been trying to catch up. I think it was it's one of those problems where we started it in lockdown when we had all this time. And of course, as lockdown sort of wound down, we found ourselves both very busy doing other things. So we slowed down in our output. But a couple of months ago, we got together for Tim came down to stay with me for 3 days and we just kept burning through. We recorded as many as we could and we managed to get 10 episodes done. So yes, more is on the way. Yeah,
they're really good. What do you think was the best decade for music?
Wow. Well, I think you were always nostalgic about the era that you were first falling in love with records and falling in love and buying records. For me, that was the 80s. I think the 80s is a much maligned era. I think it's becoming better. Its reputation is better now than it was maybe 10 years ago. Um, I just think it was such an experimental era for music that was being driven a lot by new technology, things like sampling, things like digital keyboards, computer recording. It was so creative, and pop music was really at an absolute peak in the 80s. What I mean by that is some of the most experimental pop music was also some of the most commercially successful. Things like Prince, for example. Prince was so experimental, and yet for a time, he was the biggest pop star on the planet. That could never happen now. Could never happen now, I mean, okay, Billie Eilish is a bit quirky, Taylor Swift's a bit quirky in places, but essentially they're pretty mainstream sounding. Prince would release some of the most bizarre singles, and they would go to number one. And I think the 80s is almost unique in that respect. The 70s is an amazing decade. 60s is an amazing decade in terms of, 70s is great for great rock albums and singer-songwriter albums. But in terms of sonic innovation, the 80s is way out in front for me. When you think of all those great post-punk groups as well, the aforementioned XTC, Depeche Mode, Tears for Fears, Wire, Susie and the Banshees, The Cure, New Order, Joy Division. I mean, some of those came out in the late 70s. Obviously they did, but the 80s is kind of that era for me. So I think the 80s, partly because I was growing up in that era and buying records, all the ZTT records, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Propaganda. I adored that stuff. I absolutely.
The first Seal album.
The first who album? Sorry,
Seal on ZTT.
Seal album. Amazing record. Absolutely. ABC's Lexicon of Love, which I've also just recently remixed. What an album! Talk, Color of Spring, Spirit of Eden, It's My Life. To me, these are amongst the greatest records ever made, and they came out of that era because they were being driven, I think, by the technology, and B, by the spirit of the times, that you can be experimental and you can still be in the top 10. You can still be on top of the pops. And that's not true now. And I don't think it was true in the 60s and 70s as much as it was in the 80s.
Every time a song came on the radio in the 80s or in the top 40 charts, every song sounded completely different.
Right, exactly. Kate Bush, we talked about Kate Bush. She's a quintessential 80s artist. Hounds of Love, 1985, right in the middle of the 80s. Running Up That Hill, what an extraordinary piece of pop music that sounds like nothing else before or since. And yet it's been it is now one of the biggest selling records of all time. I mean, those kind of things just couldn't happen now. And so I think that's why the 80s will always be special to me.
Just a few more, Stephen. I like to ask my guests the following questions.
Okay.
If you could go back and relive one musical moment from your career, what would it be?
Oh, there have been some great moments. I mean, I've been very lucky in my career. I think doing 3 nights at the Royal Albert Hall during the To the Bone tour, what a thrill that was. What a thrill. I mean, to do one night, but to be doing 3 nights and selling them out as a solo artist with my name on the front of the venue, metaphorically speaking, because I don't actually have that, but you know what I mean. Metaphorically speaking, to have my name on the front of that venue, 3 nights with my band, sold out. I maybe that's probably the peak, certainly to date anyway, of my experience as a live performer. That felt like some kind of vindication. Yeah.
I've watched it on. In fact, I bought it on iTunes. Fantastic show.
Yeah. The Home Invasion. Yes, the Home Invasion. Yeah.
For us music fans, music is the soundtrack to our memories. What song or album, when you listen to it, brings back the best memories for you?
That's interesting, because I was talking about this the other day, because we were talking about on another podcast or a radio show. I was talking about songs that make me nostalgic for childhood, and I was talking about my music in a way, but also songs like What Life Brings on the new record is essentially a song about nostalgia for childhood. And I was talking about some of the other music that makes me feel that way. There's an album by, not a particularly well-known record, there's an album by an artist called Virginia Astley. It was released in the mid-'80s, that decade again, and it's called From Gardens Where We Feel Secure. And it's a beautiful record. It's got the sounds of church bells, birds singing on a summer day, the sound of a school, that sound of a piano that reminds you of school pianos. Mm-hmm. So not the big grand Steinway piano, but that kind of little small upright piano sound always takes me back to school and music room in school. It's got that piano sound on it. It's got the sound of a children's choir on it. It takes me back to those never-ending summer holidays that we had when we were kids, that 6 weeks in the summer that always used to feel like it was going to go on forever. Of course, it never did. So it's that album, Virginia Astley, From Gardens Where We Feel Secure. If you've never heard it, check that album out. It will take you back to your childhood, I guarantee.
I will do that. I've never heard it, but I definitely will do that.
Yeah.
Out of all the music in your collection, which artist or band do you have the most albums by?
Oh, wow. Okay. I have a lot of Pink Floyd records, lots of different pressings of Pink Floyd record, because they are probably my favorite band of all over the years. But I also have a lot of Miles Davis records, because he was very prolific. So I got maybe 50 or 60 Miles records. I've got a lot of records by not necessarily my favorite artists, but artists that are very prolific. So there's an artist that I absolutely adore called Muslim Gauze, who passed away 20 years ago, but he was an electronic artist who was incredibly prolific. He made like 120 albums in like the 20 years he was recording, and I think I've got them all. So I've got a lot of Muslim Gauze records. I've got a lot of Aphex Twin records, probably about 30 or 40 Aphex Twin records. I've got a lot of Neil Young records, probably about 40 or 50 Neil Young records. I think I should probably stop there, Mark, because I'll go, there's a lot of artists I've got. There's a lot of artists I've probably got about 30 to 40 records. So there's something anyway. Yeah.
What song or album is your guilty pleasure?
I don't believe in the notion of guilty pleasures. I think, for example, an artist that you might say, if you weren't me, would be a guilty pleasure would be ABBA, who I still think are one of the greatest pop artists of all time. But I notice sometimes when I tell people that, they still kind of look at me as if I'm being ironic. I'm really not. I think, if you want to understand anything about pop music, how to construct brilliantly created and produced and written pop music, you listen to the Beatles, you listen to the Beach Boys, and you listen to ABBA, and you listen to the Bee Gees. Bee Gees, another one of my favorites. I'm a massive Bee Gees fan. And I don't know, would they be considered a guilty pleasure too? I think some people still look at the kind of disco era, the Saturday Night Fever era, and think it's all a bit cheesy. But me, when I hear Staying Alive or Night Fever or How Deep Is Your Love or anything by the Bee Gees, I still think it's some of the greatest pop music ever made. And I am in awe of its genius. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. I don't really believe in this concept of guilty pleasures. I'm proud of loving this stuff, but at the same time, I'm aware that perhaps it's not quote unquote cool to like Bee Gees or ABBA or stuff like that.
Well, when I asked that question, most people mention the Bee Gees and ABBA.
Well, it's funny because they are still seen as a bit naff. But the funny thing is, as you say, actually everyone loves them.
Yeah.
So there's something very odd going. There's a kind of cognitive dissonance thing going on there. I love this, but it's a bit uncool, isn't it? Well, but if you love it and you're cool and everyone else that's cool also loves it, then why isn't it cool? Actually, I think ABBA kind of are a bit cool now, aren't they? Everyone loves ABBA now, but Bee Gees still, I think, still on the borderline. I think people still feel like, it's not cool to like Bee Gees. I fucking love them. I've got about 20 or 30 Bee Gees records. I think I've got them all, and every single one of them is got genius moments on it.
Especially a lot of their earlier stuff, before they went disco. It's amazing.
Even after some of the albums they made during the years when they were completely persona non grata because disco had become so unfashionable. Albums like Living Eyes, One, Still Waters, ESP. ESP's got that big hit. They had that big number one hit in the UK called You Win Again. You might remember that.
Tremendous tune.
Amazing, right? Fucking amazing. Fucking amazing. And that's from 87. That's when they were very uncool. In fact, they couldn't have been less cool at that time. That album is brilliant. I mean, yes, it sounds very 80s, but as we've already discussed, I love the 80s, so I don't care.
What's on your musical bucket list that you would like to do next?
Oh, that's easy. A movie. I want to do a movie soundtrack. I've been talking about this for 20 years. The word cinema and cinematic has come up several times in our conversation. So you can see how important the idea of cinema is to me, and how the idea of cinema and music work together. I think the combination of the two together is so powerful. You can have great visuals, but the music somehow takes it higher. And the other way around, we're talking about the videos. You can have a great song, but a great video can somehow make it more than the sum of its parts. And so I've always been slightly frustrated that I've never had the invitation yet to do a soundtrack for a cool movie, to work with the director on creating the whole sound design and the music and the sound world for a movie or a TV show. Could be a cool TV show these days. I think TV is definitely up there with cinema these days in that sense, isn't it?
It's weird because it's a no-brainer.
Well, this is it. You'd think so. But you know what? Funnily enough, I met with a few music producers over the years, and one of them said to me something which has always stayed with me, and I've kind of used sometimes to console myself when I'm getting frustrated. I've never been asked to do a movie. She said to me, "Your music is already so cinematic and so visual that directors would struggle to put that music with their visuals. And what they're actually looking for is music which is almost blank. It doesn't have any strong visual identity of its own, so that they can put it with their music, and suddenly the music and the visuals become one. And your music is so visual already that directors would struggle to imagine it in any other way." And I don't know whether she was just fobbing me off because she knew I was disappointed. She wanted to make me feel better. But I've always kind of reminded myself of that and wondered if maybe that's one of the reasons that maybe movie directors listen to my music and think it's got too much strong visual identity already. Maybe it's bullshit. I don't know.
On the rare occasion you get time away from writing and recording music, touring and remixing other artists and hosting your podcast, how do you spend your time relaxing?
Well, I got married just before COVID. I got married 4 years ago, and I inherited 2 stepchildren, and I've got 2 dogs now, one of which is fast asleep on the chair. So there's Lenny. I got 2 dogs now. So, I've become a bit of a family man, at least a lot more than I ever thought I would, because I spent the first 50 years of my life without children, without being married, and kind of got used to being a bit selfish about the way I went about my life and not having those kind of responsibilities and commitments. And now I do, and I love it. And so any free time I have, I'll spend with my family. Like this weekend gone, we just went down to Hastings for the weekend. We had a lovely weekend at the sea. So I'm fitting that into my life now, or should I say the other way around? My music stuff now fits into my family life. My creative stuff fits around my family rather than the other way around. Yeah.
Good. So, Stephen, that's me done. Is there anything that you would like to mention before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of stuff there, didn't we?
And there was actually more. I had to skip some stuff, so we'll be here all day.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed that. I think we covered a lot of ground. So if you're happy, then that's a great point to finish, I think. Yeah.
No, I am happy, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. The album is tremendous. I wish you all the best with it, and hopefully we'll see some sort of live version of the album soon.
I really hope so. As I say, like I said, that's work in progress. Yeah, that's my next big project, I think. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Tremendous. Thanks, Mark. Thanks so much for the support, mate. And good luck with the podcast. I hear it's going from strength to strength. Mate, continue to do so. Fabulous,
Thank
Mark.
you. Well,
Cheers,
have a good
buddy.
weekend. Have a good weekend.
You too. Likewise. Cheers, man.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.